Hi, welcome to my presentation, The Tiananmen Square Uprising of 1989. In this presentation, I will start by laying down the important historical context for best understanding the events of April, May and June of 1989. I'll then proceed to the key events themselves, how they were experienced and how they unravelled. Finally, I'll offer some conclusions. The academic Rana Mitter usefully observes the following by way of understanding politics in China today. The interlocution of Western political ideas with China began back in the 19th century as the country was and felt attacked from the outside, namely by the so-called foreign devils, the forces of imperialism, starting with the Opium Wars. Notably from this point, the concepts of nationalism and social Darwinism entered Chinese political discourse. In the dying days of the last dynasty to rule over China during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the ideas of a parliamentary democracy, having a constitution and being part of a citizenship body and an international system of nation states, these ideas were discussed and are political notions important to date. In the 4 decades of a weak and unstable Republic China, the 1910s, 20s, 30s and 40s, in part shaped by the rivalry of the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party, various isms were part of the political debate: nationalism, socialism, feminism, anarchism. That said, the dominant ism with the weight of history behind it was Confucianism, whose ideological role can best be explained by way of comparison to Judeo-Christian influence in the West. Despite the Chinese Communist Party formally rejecting Confucianism, it has made use of some of its core tenets: hierarchy, mutual obligation, self-development, social order. This year is the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square Uprising of 1989, which must be seen in the light of another significant anniversary for China, publicly celebrated, commonly known as May 4th. As background, important background to this, during the First World War, double dealing of the Western Allies with China and Japan led to the outcome that German colonies on Chinese land would be returned not to China but to Japan. Japan in Chinese nationalist discourse then and now is considered a major so-called foreign devil. This was a key trigger for the May 4th movement of 1919. Turning now to Mitter's quote: "Patriotic demonstrations by students in Beijing on May 4th became symbolic of a wider feeling of national outrage that China was being weakened internally by its unstable militarist governments and externally by the continuing presence of foreign imperialism. The outrage symbolised by May 4th demonstrations gave rise to a whole range of new thinking collectively termed the New Culture movement. Political thinkers turned to various isms such as liberalism, socialism, anarchism, and also sought inspiration in a variety of foreign examples, including nationalist figures such as Washington and Kossuth, but also non-European figures such as Gandhi and Ataturk. The Chinese Communist Party was founded in the intellectual climate of May 4th. The May 4th movement, giving birth then to a new culture movement, had as its twin pillars Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. It's not coincidental that one of the prominent slogans of the Tiananmen Uprising of 1989 was "Hello, Mr. Democracy," a conscious reference back to May 4th. 1949 was the birth of Communist Party rule in China, the birth of a one-party, bureaucratic and totalitarian state. The brutal nature of the regime was marked by various state campaigns. Mao's repression of his own initiation of intellectual critique of the party, the 100 Flowers campaign, which he'd hoped would integrate intellectuals within the regime rather than its actual result, criticism of the party that was considered to have gone too far, and which gave birth to a democracy war movement. The crackdown came in the form of the anti-rightist movement, which effectively silenced China's intellectuals for decades to come. The Great Leap Forward of 1959-62 was a bizarre set of initiatives to launch the country's agricultural and industrial development, to bring it on par with the West's, which was a catastrophic failure that contributed to its estimated 20 million deaths. And the Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 76, at its peak, 66 to 69. This was a huge campaign of ideological Communist Party renewal in which Mao attacked his own party, in fact recruited the youth in his party to attack his own party. This was the peak of the cult of Mao. The country descended into chaos, self-destruction, civil war. Indeed, the People's Liberation Army forced the Red Guards, the loyal youth-based Maoists who carried out the Cultural Revolution under Mao's instruction, back home by 1969 and sent masses of them for years into the countryside for re-education by the peasants, famously known as the sent-down youth. The Cultural Revolution remained propaganda until 1976, the year of Mao's death. Again, I'll turn now to the quote by Rana Mitter vis-à-vis the Cultural Revolution. It was strongly anti-intellectual and xenophobic, condemning those such as doctors or teachers who are accused of being expert rather than read, and casting suspicions on anyone who had connections with the outside world. 1949 to 1976 were the Mao years. What followed was a process of change in economic strategy and the birth of an era post-1978 to date known as opening and reform, led by the new head of the Chinese Communist Party, Deng Xiaoping. Deng coined the concept four modernizations, referring specifically to agriculture, industry, defence and science and technology. In the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, Mao's death, the arrest of the Gang of Four, Mao's closest allies during his campaign of turmoil, and the initial manifestation of opening and reform, a space was born for the 1978-79 Democracy Wall movement, organically starting in Beijing and spreading to other cities. This was a cathartic space in which many of the victims of the Cultural Revolution posted dazibao, large character posters, some in their own blood, recording their ordeals and demanding social and political change. The most prominent outspoken participant, Wei Jinsheng, called for a fifth modernisation, democracy, stating the other four weren't possible without it. During the clampdown of the Democracy Wall movement, he was arrested and imprisoned. For many of the participants of the later 1989 Tiananmen Square uprising, Wei Jinsheng was a hero and a source of inspiration. From the clampdown of the Democracy Wall movement onwards, the message from Deng Xiaoping was that economic opening and reform still meant a central role for the party. He famously said, "If you open a door, some flies will get in," seeing the party as very much the guardian at the door. To appease hardliners, Deng initiated the 1983 anti-spiritual pollution campaign to curb the worst excesses of the West. However, the 1980s remained a decade of tremendous societal openness, particularly in comparison to the Mao years before. Rana Mitter. The group which benefited most greatly from the reforms in contrast with the Cultural Revolution were intellectuals. No longer were they termed the stinking ninth, that is, the ninth class of undesirables in the Cultural Revolution terminology. Instead, education was encouraged. The new freedoms that intellectuals enjoyed gave them the appetite for more. After student protests in 1985-86 demanding further opening up of the party, Hu Yaobang was forced to resign in 1987 and take responsibility for allowing social forces to get out of control. I'll note at this point that Hu Yaobang was a high-ranking Communist Party official who helped push through political and economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping's direction. However, because he was sympathetic to the student protests of 85-86, he was scapegoated as a promoter of bourgeois liberalisation and ousted from his position in the party, returning to Rana Mitter. In April 1989, Hu Yaobang died. It was a long-standing tradition in China that the death of a well-respected figure could trigger demonstrations. In this case, students around China used the occasion of his death to organise protests against the continuing role of the Chinese Communist Party in public life. I turn now to the story. 2 books, one technically fiction, the other non-fiction autobiographical. Ma Jin's Beijing Coma is, I would suggest, the best account of everyday life in and through the Tiananmen Square uprising. It's an extraordinary read. Zheng Tong was a participant of the student movement. Combined, their books offer a distinct insight into the story of 1989 as it unfolded. The Tiananmen Square uprising took place during the months of April and May, with the military crackdown commencing in early June. In the words of Ma Jin and Zheng Tong then, I'll now talk us through the pivotal events and developments. Commencing then with the death of Hu Yaobang, a year of anniversaries, the birth of the movement. Have you heard about the eulogies going up in the Triangle? Some students in the creative writing programme have even composed a memorial couplet. Then he turned to Xu Tong. What does the Pantheon Society plan to do? Didn't you say that 1989 would be a good time to launch another protest movement, it being the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution and the 70th of China's May 4th movement? Last month, Han Dan's Democracy Salon put up some posters calling for the legalisation of independent student organisations. It looks like they have an action plan. My parents were denounced during the anti-rightist movement, and I was branded the daughter of capitalist dogs when Hu Yaobang rehabilitated millions of rightists 10 years ago. We saw him as our saviour. So I'm not against mourning his death, but you shouldn't use his death as an excuse to launch a new protest movement. You'd be falling into the government's trap. The university authorities have been told to remain on guard. We must call for the overthrow of the one-party dictatorship and the end of economic profiteering by corrupt government officials. We can ask the government to give a fair appraisal of Hu Yaobang's political achievements and to repudiate campaigns they launched against spiritual pollution and bourgeois liberalism. We must call for the right to publish independent newspapers and an end to press censorship. Our demands must be concrete. Yes, and autonomous, democratically elected student unions. Zheng Tong. More and more Dazibo, again big character posters, began appearing in the Triangle. The Triangle is a central place at Peking University where posters and leaflets were displayed. No longer just memorials to Hu Yaobang, they included inflammatory declarations like, those who should die, don't die. Wang Dan led a group of Beta students, Beta being short for Peking University, to the National People's Congress that afternoon with 7 demands. Restore Hu Yaobang's reputation. End the anti-bourgeois liberalism campaign. Guarantee free press, free speech and the right to peaceful demonstrations. Increase the budget for education and end official corruption. A movement had begun. The marches to and in Tiananmen Square reached another big peak at Hu Yaobang's state funeral, immediately after which a group of student leaders attempted to deliver a petition of democratic demands to the party. This petition was unmet and it became a lesson and moment of political radicalisation for the movement. Wang Fei and Mu Sen passed through the second block of police, walking up the steps and carried the wreath and petition inside the Great Hall of the People, emerging only with the petition a few seconds later. Look, the officials have taken the wreath but refused to receive the petition. Wang Fei and Mu Sen exchanged a few words with Han Dan, Hang Fei and Qi Shi. They all 5 of them climbed up the steps again. 10 plainclothes officers rushed out of the Great Hall and stood in their way. Hai Feng suddenly dropped to his knees and lifted the white petition above his head. Wang Fei and Mu Sen stood beside him and hesitated for a moment. Then they too decided to kneel down. Qi Shi looked a little awkward and stepped to the side. Hang Dan swung his shoulder bag over his back and tried desperately to pull the 3 of them up. Hai Feng refused to budge. He lifted the petition higher in the air and began shouting something we couldn't hear. The students yelled, "Don't kneel down, stand up, stand up." They're kneeling down like submissive subjects petitioning an emperor. It's an unhealthy legacy of feudal China. What the hell are they thinking of, kneeling down like that? The organising committee didn't tell them to kneel. Zuzu, some of the students at the back have got on their knees too. What should we do? Zuzu undid the top button of his khaki jacket and shouted, "We can't ask for democracy on bent knees. Tell the bastards to stand up." Fuming with rage, he pushed his way to the front of the crowd and yelled, stand up," to the 3 students still kneeling on the steps. The students behind us shouted, "Stand up, democracy shouldn't be begged for," and moved forward, propelling the students in front against the swaying lines of the armed police. Through the shouting, I could hear people weeping. Stop kneeling," the students cried. The waves of noise rolled over the heads of the armed police and bounced off the glass walls of the Great Hall. Shentong. I noticed that many students who had never cared about politics and protests before were now raising their fists in the air. That day was one of the turning points of the movement. On the 26th of April, the official mouthpiece of the Communist Party in China denounced the student demonstrators. The result, the day after, huge processions to Tiananmen Square, which successfully faced off the police and carried with it a citywide mass festival of resistance. The bright morning sun shone down on the green poplars lining the pavement and on the green caps and uniforms of the armed police who were blocking the street ahead. The police had formed a human wall about 40 rows deep. From a distance, they looked like a belt of trees on the edge of a city. Local residents packed the pavements. Their cries of "Long live the students" echoed off surrounding buildings and the pedestrian flyover. There was a sense that the student movement had become a people's movement. The day before, the People's Daily had published an editorial, "We must take a firm stand against turmoil." It described our movement as a planned conspiracy to overthrow the government. It created uproar. Continue the class boycott, demand a dialogue with the government and a retraction of the 26th of April editorial. The People's Police love the people. The police fight official corruption, not patriotic students. The waves of chanting voices continue to roll through the air above us and crash against the buildings. The students rammed forward in regular bursts, then charged at the chink, making it wider and wider until the whole police wall collapsed. With deafening cheers, the procession surged straight through and began attacking the second wall. Onlookers standing on the pavements and pedestrian flyover roared in support. The students merged into the morass of police caps, which once more scattered to the sides. The jubilant students cried out to the officers, "Thank you, comrades." The onlookers applauded our victory and handed out bottles of Coca-Cola and lemonade. The police stood impassively at the sides of the road. A few officers and students searched around for lost shoes, then flung them at one another. "There's no more food or drink in the shops around here. The local residents have bought it all to give to the students." The anniversary of May 4th, 1919 was another big opportunity to demonstrate. By this point, the movement had become one of students and ordinary workers. Also, the student movement showed signs of 2 factions emerging: the dialogue delegation with the aim of negotiating democratic reforms with the party, and a more radical hunger strike wing, more radical in tactics, if not politics. Shentong, May 4th. Tiananmen Square and Chang'an Avenue were packed not only with students but with Uprising, who were carrying their own banners with slogans, "Never forget the spirit of May 4th, down with graft, fight official corruption." People were climbing the monument of the people's heroes and standing on the stairs of the building. Everyone was making so much noise that it was hard to hear anything. May 7th. After the May 4th rally, there was a general feeling of inertia and letdown among the students. We had been successful in gathering in the square a number of times, and we knew we'd gotten the government's attention by doing so, but now we were just waiting for the officials to respond to our request for dialogue. May 8th. Knowing the government wanted the class boycott ended, the Beda Preparatory Committee posted a Dazibao stating 5 conditions that the authorities should meet before the students would return to class. An apology from the People's Daily for its 26th of April editorial and a fairer assessment of the student movement. Recognition by the government of the democratically elected student organisations. Disclosure by the State Council of official corruption cases and establishment of a department to investigate and punish the guilty. The reinstatement of Qin Ban Li as editor-in-chief of the World Economic Herald. Qin Ban Li was sympathetic to the student movement, so was ousted from his post. And finally, repeal of the 10 requirements that had been imposed by the Beijing municipal government for a permit to demonstrate. May 12th. The Triangle was buzzing with people arguing the pros and cons of a Dazibo that had been posted the night before. It is time for us to hold a mass hunger strike, the large characters said. This wasn't the first time I had heard the idea of a hunger strike, but until this point no one had made a public declaration like this. The authors of the poster listed 2 conditions for ending such a strike. The first was that the government should officially declare the movement a patriotic action. Second, that it should continue a dialogue with the students. It should conduct a dialogue with the students. The hunger strikers re-energised the movement, but also furthered the factualisation. Gorbachev's state visit to China was significant in that it brought Western media into the country, so was a point of leverage for the movement to pressurise the party into dialogue. Look, it's 9:30 already. Do you think the government would dream of holding a welcoming ceremony for a foreign statesman in front of a crowd of bedraggled hunger strikers? You lot thought you could hold the government to ransom, but they don't need to listen to you. They can hold the ceremony somewhere else if they want. There's no point the students staying here any longer. If we withdraw from the square now, it would be an admission of failure. Why don't you go to the headquarters and sign up to burn yourself to death then? The headquarters has just held their first meeting and decided to scrap that idea. Their latest plan is to get the hunger strikers to lie down on Chang'an Avenue after the intellectuals march this afternoon. He seemed to have lost his enthusiasm. Then they'll start calling for class boycotts, teachers' strikes, shopkeepers' strikes, and before long we'll have a revolution on our hands, Musen said. The hunger strikers ruined everything. The reformist wing of the government wants our movement to progress peacefully. The hardliners want it to end in violence so they can oust Zhao Ziyang from power. By continuing this hunger strike, we are playing into their hands. I'll note at this point that Zhao Ziyang was a high-ranking Communist Party official committed to a free market in China and in that context, the separation of party and state, and was sympathetic to the student movement. In due course, he was ousted. Who's to say Zhao Ziyang and his lot are any better than the hardliners? I've heard rumours that Zhao Ziyang's son has been using his power to buy colour televisions at low state prices and selling them at huge profits on the black market. There's no hope of a peaceful settlement now. The dialogue was going well. Why did you insist that it be broadcast live? The hunger strikers don't trust the dialogue delegation. They wanted to hear for themselves what was being said during the meeting. Everyone's focused on the hunger strike now. We have no choice but to go along with it and lend it our full support. This is supposed to be a democracy movement, not a revolution. If you take things too far, you'll be crushed in the end. Our problem now is that no one person or group is capable of taking control of the square. Shentong, May 17th. 2 million people, what seemed like all of Beijing, lined the streets for the biggest rally China had ever seen. The hunger strike was now in its 5th day. More than 2,000 of the 3,600 strikers had been sent to hospital. 6 were critically ill. The Uprising, the ordinary people, were now actively involved in the movement. I heard that even the city's thieves had agreed to go on a 2-day strike to show their support for the students. Everyone was concentrating on the student movement, and there was a great spirit of comradeship. As I moved among the people and saw the workers cheering, I remembered something Yang Tao had said early on, that this might become another movement for national salvation. His point was that in recent mass movements in China, very few people had been aware of the ideology behind the demonstrations, and their involvement had been based solely on emotion. I was overwhelmed by what I was seeing on the streets, but I was worried that what Yang Tao had said was true. The people were looking to the students to lead them out of discontent. Our movement was about democratic reform, but a lot of people in the square had lost their vision of what we were after, which was going to make it more difficult to accomplish our goal. May 18th. Here, Shengton is in an exchange with a leading member of the newly formed Workers' Autonomous Union. We've established the Workers' Autonomous Union and are going to invite intellectuals to come and speak to us. We want to do our part to support the students. I kept thinking about the workers and what the good Li Peng had said about a general strike. The student movement was meant to push the country toward faster and more extensive reforms. If the workers went on strike, it could push China into economic paralysis. I was very confused about this. I still thought of myself as a reformer, but I wasn't sure that any of us were ready to be revolutionaries. This critical addition of organised workers to the student movement is what alarmed the party the most and hastened the military suppression. Prior to the military crackdown, remarkably, the Communist Party decided to stage a debate with some members of the dialogue delegation, which was broadcast live across China. Li Peng, top Communist Party official. Li Peng was sitting stiffly on a red sofa, addressing the students in a stern and resolute voice. The government has never said that the broad masses of students are creating turmoil. We have never said that. We have unanimously praised the students' patriotic fervour. Many of the complaints they have made are justified and we are working hard to solve them. So the students' efforts have been positive. Nevertheless, events have taken a course of their own. Disorder has broken out in Beijing and it is spreading to the rest of the country. Beijing is in a state of anarchy. The government cannot ignore the situation. We must protect the students and the socialist system. Factory workers, employees of government organisations and urban residents have gone to Tiananmen Square to encourage the students to continue their hunger strike. I do not approve of their actions. Note the juxtaposition here between students and workers. The next shot was of Qi Zi, still in his striped hospital pyjamas, upbraiding Li Peng. I thought there was no need to go over this again, but it seems that you still don't understand. So I will repeat once more. We will only leave the square on condition that the slanderous 26th of April editorial is revoked and the government engages with us in an immediate, open, equal, direct and sincere dialogue. If these demands aren't met, the newsreader then announced the dialogue had come to an end without any issues being resolved. Loud debates erupted all over the restaurant. This was the first time in the 40-year history of the Chinese Republic that the government leaders had engaged in a televised debate with a group of ordinary citizens. Everyone was astounded. Martial law was announced on the 20th of May. The full brunt of military force was held off until the 4th of June. In this period, students erected a goddess of democracy in Tiananmen Square, facing off the portrait of Chairman Mao, and launched the Democracy University Initiative. An official announcement blared through the government loudspeakers. While martial law is in force, foreigners are forbidden to participate in any activities which contravene the martial law edict. The military police have the right to use whatever means necessary to deal with the offenders. The crowds in the square were still shouting and braying. One side of the square yelled, "Reinstate Zhao Ziyang," while the other side shouted, "Protect Zhao Ziyang." If we're going to defend ourselves against the army, we must buy weapons and start military training. It's against the law for citizens to use weapons. We will wrest power from the government's hands, like the French revolutionaries who stormed the Bastille. With our blood, we will build a new Paris Commune. This is Sister Gao speaking, Deputy Chairwoman of the Beijing Students' Federation. I have an urgent announcement. We want to send 100 students to the barricades to try and persuade our comrade soldiers to turn back. Both male and female students are welcome to volunteer. 2 student marshals escorted 3 soldiers onto the upper terrace. The soldiers wanted to tell the students about their refusal to implement martial law order. The brims of their caps were drenched in sweat. Although the features were a little coarse, she was a good replica of New York's Statue of Liberty. She rose majestically from the middle of the square, directly opposite Chairman Mao's portrait, staring resolutely into the distance, her mouth tightly pursed. When I looked up at her, I felt a renewed sense of courage. Students from the Academy of Music stood up and sang The Bloodstained Spirit and Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Bare-chested boys from the Dance Academy performed the Shaanxi Province folk dance, beating drums tied to their waists. The jubilant ceremony then came to an end and crowds began to scatter. Today's paper says the authorities have called the erecting of the goddess of democracy an illegal act and an affront to China's national pride and democratic image. Hai Feng said, walking up with a newspaper in his hand, he too had been going back to the campus every night and usually only turned up to the square in the afternoon. As the crowd roared their applause again, a stern announcement blasted from every government speaker in the square. We repeat again, the inauguration of the Democracy University has not been approved by the State Education Committee. The instigators must be prepared to take legal responsibility for their actions. The voice echoed menacingly through the square, seemingly trying to prove that even the air above us belonged to the party. The distant gunfire sounded like a string of firecrackers exploding. I felt as though we were live crabs being tossed inside a scorching wok. Musen was still delivering his speech. Chairman Mao said the People's Liberation Army is a school, but did the State Education Committee approve its inauguration? The party trains the army to suppress the people. We will train Democrats to serve the nation. Tiananmen Square is our lecture hall. The rest of this vast nation is our campus. We don't need the approval of any bloody education committee to establish our university. The crowd laughed approvingly. Once this period of darkness is over, we will witness the emergence of a democratic republic, and our efforts will come to fruition. Whenever a flash went off, everyone tensed up, mistaking it for gunshot. The city residents who were reluctant to leave the square converged in small groups to discuss what they'd just heard. So that's what democracy is about, one man said. I didn't realise we'd have to overthrow the Communist Party to achieve it. They stand here and talk about democracy while the army tanks are rolling towards them. They think they can change this country. They're so naive. I told them to leave the square weeks ago, but they wouldn't listen. A few members of the Workers' Federation's Dare to Die squad, all wearing red armbands, ran over and shouted, "The soldiers are killing people on West Chang'an Avenue. The citizens need our help. Come on, everyone, let's go. We'll fight those bastards to the death." The crackdown, the horror. Dawn after the army moved in on Tiananmen Square. As dawn approached, the air filled with a smell of scorched tyres and khaki uniforms. About 2,000 of us had left the square, but our crowd seemed to dwindle the further we went. A long line of tanks and armoured carriers had formed a solid blockade, screening off the view to the square. Behind them, a green sun hovered at the horizon. Wang Fei switched on his black megaphone and shouted, "The people will be victorious. Down with fascism." Now, this quote specifically has a trigger warning. I won't read it aloud, but I will allow time for you to read it should you want to. Okay, some conclusions. Aside from elements of the student movement that had revolutionary ambition, in the main, it sought democratic change through reform. Many students put faith in key soft figures of the Communist Party and in the so-called People's Liberation Army not to attack the people. The student movement ended up unclear in its aims and, in its final days, was losing momentum. In that context, then, the military crackdown didn't really make sense, except when we take into account the critical additional component that became part of this movement, which threatened to deliver widespread societal change, potentially revolution. And that was the organised labour movement and its demand for a general strike, which, you know, had it realised its demand for a general strike, then the Tiananmen Square uprising of 1989 may well have ousted the Communist Party. So organised labour movement with its revolutionary potential, that's what alarmed the Chinese Communist Party the most and in fact spurred the military clampdown. Okay, thanks for listening.